Get that nice annoying sound that she's putting down with authority. And I'm going to find my...
I'm even going to go into do not disturb on my phone. That's how serious this thing is.
This is legit.
Do not disturb right there.
All the way around. All right, well, let's get it going. So I started my PowerPoint, didn't start my share.
It's pretty cool to see some familiar names in here. Thank you guys for coming.
Yeah. Nick, this isn't a picture of penguins, I swear. So. Sorry, it wasn't designed to be a jab. If I'd known, I would have put a different screensaver on. So, all right. So for those of you that are familiar names and faces for Mr. Nick Page himself, I want to say first and foremost, welcome and hello. My name is Nick Stover. I'm not Nick Page, N-I-C Stover. And I am the founder of Nature Photography Classes. And I'm really excited for the third leg of our winter speaker series, which is with Nick Page. So this has been the deeper dive into post-processing. For those of you that have joined us all the way along, we got to hear from Michael Fry going into range masks and local adjustments. Spent some time with David Kingham on rethinking tones and ways to use Lightroom in new ways. And Nick tonight is going to show us a huge variety of ways to use Photoshop in ways that we haven't been doing before. I personally know I'm going to learn some new ways to improve my selection. So I'm really excited about this. Also want to mention that Sean Bagshaw will be rounding the rounding the winter series out at the end of the month. And he'll be talking extensively about blending and putting that information in there. So hopefully you'll be able to join us there. Nick's going to be spending the majority of his time on the images you guys submitted. He was complimenting you guys on the quality of the images and how nice it was to go through there, which is exciting all the way through. So with that, I'm actually going to stop my share and turn it right over to Nick, because we got a lot of stuff to go through.
So thank you guys for showing up to hang out with us while we nerd out about Luminosity masks. I am a self-proclaimed Luminosity mask nerd. It's one of those things that once you kind of start diving into what they are and what their capabilities are, that it's really difficult to not see and to not constantly use all of the potential techniques that are available to you when you know how to use that stuff. So I'm going to share my screen, kind of share a few images that I have taken. Let's see here. Share screen, host disabled participant screen sharing. So we're going to need you to enable that.
You're enabled.
But yeah, so I had an opportunity to import all of the photos that were submitted, and there were some really, really good images that were submitted. That's what we're going to be post-processing for the most part, your guys' images, and it was actually a treat. It's a lot more fun to work on other people's stuff rather than your own tired images. So, okay, so let me know if you can see my screen. Do we have a thumbs up?
We are good to go.
Okay, so this is the type of boring imagery that I like to create. I'm really drawn to fairly dramatic scenes, and I do a lot of storm chasing as a result. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I have a lot of forest scenes, a lot of seascapes, but I also teach in places like Iceland, the Faroe Islands. I'm absolutely in love with images that have a sense of depth, but also have a sense of moment. So I'm always looking for dappled light. This is actually a presentation from a different talk, so it's not going to line up with what I'm saying, but I shoot a lot of seascapes, and I'm in love with images that have that dynamic light. That's a common theme in a lot of my imagery, but also a lot of movement and energy and moment. Those are the kind of things that I'm often looking for, especially when I'm shooting seascapes. So photograph a lot of seascapes, a lot of storms, a lot of forest scenes. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so, you know, this is the kind of stuff that I have available to me, and that's the kind of stuff that I shoot a lot of. So yeah, let's go over here and stop sharing for a second. So with this whole webinar thing, first of all of you should teach a webinar at some point, because if you've ever post-processed, now imagine post-processing with an audience of hundreds. It is, it's interesting because, as you know, there's never a guaranteed result when you're post-processing. Like no matter how good and how confident you think you are at post-processing, there's always that opportunity for failure. And the more people you have in the audience, the more guaranteed that failure is. So I'm going to do my best to hopefully not fail. But the one thing that you guys can do to get the most out of this is let's make this a two-way conversation. And what I need from you guys are questions. So if there are no questions after teaching a technique, I'm going to assume that that I'm such a great teacher that you all just have it down perfectly. But if there is any little thing that I need to expand on or anything like that, that's really where you're going to get the benefit from this in-person webinar, is the fact that you can ask questions. That's what makes this different than a tutorial. So
feel free to ask questions or heckle if he's not doing a good job. It'll be all right. Put your questions into the Q&A though. It's a lot easier for me to keep those organized and so they don't get lost in the chat, but toss them in the Q&A as we get rolling and we'll be good to go.
All right. So we're going to just jump into it here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's jump over into Lightroom. All of my workflows always start in Lightroom. And it's because this is where I catalog. This is where I do a lot of my cataloging and my raw processing. I don't use Bridge. But what we're going to do here is let's just open a single image up here inside of Photoshop. Now, when you open something up inside of Photoshop, typically I always highly encourage people to open things up as a smart object in Photoshop. So that's the way that you do that is you right click on an image or on the thumbnail, you go to edit in, open as smart object in Photoshop. And the reason we want to do that is because that's going to allow us to re-access that raw file at any time, which means that anything that we do inside of Lightroom, nothing is permanent, nothing is baked in. We can always go and create more copies of that raw file. And that's one of the techniques I'm going to be showing you guys today is being able to go back, re-access that raw file and blend it back in with itself. So what is a luminosity mask? A luminosity mask, if I go up and I create one, let's move this. Up here we have TK8, which is TK Actions. It's just a luminosity mask creation tool. This is like it basically is a really fast way of creating luminosity masks. There's also Lumenzia, there's Raya Pro. TK8 is kind of one that a lot of people use because it's very powerful. We don't actually need this though. If we wanted to create our very first luminosity mask, we would go to our channels tab here. So right here we have layers, channels, paths. If I click on channels, I hold down Control and click on the RGB channel. We're going to get some marching ants. So that tells me that currently we have an active selection. If I go down to this button here that looks suspiciously like a layer mask button, and I click on that, you can see that it's just created this alpha 1 channel. Now, if I click and look at this alpha 1, you can see that this is just a black and white version of our photo. And that is all a luminosity mask is it is a black and white version of our photo. And that's going to be used as either a layer mask or it's going to be used as an active selection. So there's different ways to use these. If you think about how a layer mask works, white reveals, black conceals. If we have, let's say that we take this black and white version of our photo and we create a brightness contrast adjustment layer. So just a simple brightness contrast adjustment layer. And now we have this as its layer mask. That means that as I adjust our brightness here, it's going to affect our highlights more than our shadows because the highlights are brighter. Obviously, they're more selected than our shadows. So this adjustment is going to go more into the highlights and less into the shadows. We could do the exact opposite if we wanted to. If we looked at this layer mask and we inverted it by going Control or Command I for invert, now we have like a negative of our image, right? So we could essentially darken our shadows or brighten our shadows or add contrast to our shadows or decrease contrast to our shadows, this luminosity mask is controlling where this adjustment can go. So that is using a luminosity mask as a layer mask. So it's literally a luminosity mask. But what we can also do is let's delete this layer mask here. And let's say that we wanted to brighten and add contrast with this layer mask, or with this brightness contrast adjustment layer, but we only wanted it to go into certain areas. So what we could do in this case is let's just put a black layer mask on here. Now remember, black conceals, white reveals. So I could either just go in here and by freehand with a white paintbrush, go in here and just start painting. But the problem is it's creating a very flat result because it's just going everywhere. If we look at our layer mask, it's just going everywhere. But let's say that, let's back up here. Let's say that I just wanted to brighten the highlights in a certain part of the image. What we could do is we could go back, go back here and make a selection of our highlights by holding down Control or Command and clicking on this Alpha 1. Going back to our layers, we'll hide our marching ants. And then I can go to this black layer mask with a white paintbrush and start painting here. And this is going to allow me to control where, like locally, where this adjustment's going to go. So let's say we wanted to draw attention to the bottom portion of this photo, but this luminosity selection that we currently have, because we've made an active selection of that layer mask or the luminosity mask, is going to control which tones it's going into. So we're controlling not only the area that it's going into, but which tones it's going into. And that's called a luminosity selection. So we're literally painting through a luminosity selection, because when you have a selection, it functions like a stencil. And in this case, if we were to take one more look at this, if we were to make selection of this, this particular stencil will allow our paint to go a little bit more into our highlights, but keep it a little bit out of the shadows. So it's a way of essentially creating a little stencil for yourself. That way, this adjustment's only going to go into the areas that we want it to go into. So now you can kind of start thinking about all the possibilities for this. I'm going to show you a bunch of them here currently, but that's the general premise. A luminosity mask is a black and white version of your photo used as a layer mask. A luminosity selection is a black and white version of your photo used as a stencil, and then you paint through that stencil to reveal whatever it is that on that layer. So sometimes it's an adjustment layer, sometimes it's a pixel layer, sometimes it's another smart object with a different set of color grading to it. And then you can use it to dodge and burn. You can use it to exposure blend. You can use it to add a little Orton effect only into your highlights. There's so many different uses, and that's what we're going to jump into today. So with that in mind, where are we at for questions? So this is just kind of the overall idea of it. So we'll start jumping into the techniques.
We have a lot of great questions, some of which I know you're going to demonstrate. One, Rocky Mountain Mike was asking, how do I use the luminosity mask to create a stencil and feather the edges? I know that's one of the techniques I've seen you demonstrate better than anyone's. I like this question from Harvey. I think it's relevant to here. Is opening an image as a smart object also important when opening from Bridge directly into Photoshop?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you can get away with it, open that image as a smart object, because it's a non-destructive way of working. Because otherwise, whatever you do, whatever your Adobe Camera Raw settings or Lightroom settings are, like if you open it just as a TIFF file, you're no longer going to have access to those settings. So there's a lot of times where you make a bunch of edits and you realize, wish my white balance was a little different than it is. And if you would have opened it as a smart object, it's as simple as double clicking it and warming it up. And you have a lot more flexibility with that smart object. So it's always it's a good way of working.
Perfect. Well, a lot of good questions coming in. I want to address this one. I didn't say it at the beginning. This is recorded. You will get a copy of this. You will have permanent access to this tomorrow, forever, not just for tomorrow, to be able to go back through and watch. So some of the things, if you didn't catch something or want to look at it, or we have some person that's having internet connectivity issues, you're going to be able to get the recording fine. So I want to keep you going, Nick. The questions will keep queuing up. Just keep rolling.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so let's talk about some different uses for this. One of my favorites is called dual processing. So it's dual processing, meaning processing twice the same raw file. And the reason that I do that oftentimes is to create, like in an image like this, where it's incredibly flat, we have different ways that we can address that, right? We can just add contrast, which will add contrast everywhere. Or we can create one version for our shadow areas, one version for our highlight areas. And the benefit to doing that and then blending them back into with each other, the benefit of doing that is that we can be very selective about which highlights we emphasize and which we don't. And we can also be a little bit creative with things like color temperature, sharpness, all kinds of things. So for example, let's double click on this smart object layer. We can tell, first of all, that it's a smart object layer because there's this little icon in the bottom right of the thumbnail. So that tells me that I can double click this, which we're going to do now. And that's going to bring up Adobe Camera Raw. So if we look here, we can see, well, we didn't actually do anything before we opened it up. But if we would have in Lightroom, all those adjustments would still be here. So what I want to do in this case is I want to create kind of I want to process this once with the shadows in mind. So with the shadows in mind, typically I want fairly dark shadows, but I don't want to lose any information. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually open the blacks a little bit and then bring down the exposure quite a lot. That way we're starting with a fairly dark canvas in which we're going to bring out highlight information with the next version of this file. I'm also going to cool this down just a little bit because I like my shadows to be, a little bit colder than the highlights, because the highlights, if they're warmer, are going to really serve as a visual flow for the image, because the eye is always going to be drawn to areas of contrast, warmth, and bright highlights. So we can really be in full control over the visual flow of this image if we have cold shadows and warm highlights. So I'm just going to do something like this for now for our shadow areas. I could go through and we can tweak our detail and our sharpening and all that, but I don't want to get bogged down in every little thing. But so now we've created this version of our photo that is going to be essentially for the shadow areas of the image. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the title of this layer. That's going to bring up this big long list of things that we can do. One of those things is create a new smart object via copy. So this right here is very important. New smart object via copy. That is the only way that we can duplicate this layer without those being linked. I can't just copy it. I can't just duplicate it. We have to actually create it by going new smart object via copy. Otherwise, if I edit one, I edit them both. But now we have this other layer, this other version of this smart object or of our raw file here. And in this one, we're going to process this for the highlight areas of the image. So I'm going to bring up the exposure. I'm actually going to increase contrast. So I'm bringing down the shadows a bit, increasing contrast, bringing up the exposure. And we want to warm this up quite a lot. So something like this, where I'm processing it with the highlights in mind. I'm actually going to add some saturation, and I like to do that in the calibration tab. So it's just a nice way of adding a nice saturation boost, but it also kind of gives it a little bit more contrast as well. And then I'm going to hit OK. So now we have these two very different versions of our photo that we can blend in together. So there's two different ways that we could do this. We could either grab a luminosity mask and apply it as a layer mask. But the problem with that is that's just going to blindly go everywhere. We have no control over where that's going to go or how much. So the method that I want to use for this is I'm going to create a black version or a black layer mask, right? So I'm going to hold down Alt and click on the new layer mask button. Boom. That puts a black layer mask on this layer. And now I want to go and create a black and white version of our photo. This time we're going to use TK actions. So this top left button here with the three different tones here, this is essentially your luminosity mask creation button. And so now if I look at this, we can create a lights 1, a lights 2, lights 3, or we can go and cycle through our darks. Down here is a way to modify or alter our luminosity mask or selection. And then down here in the black buttons, this is essentially what we're going to do with it. So what we want to do with it is we want to grab a luminosity mask that's going to really target our highlights. And then we want to make a selection of that we're going to then paint through. So I could go and I could create a lights 1, and then this button right here with a kind of marching ants symbol. If I click on that, it's going to load that black and white version of our photo as a selection. And we can tell it's an active selection because the outside of TK8, it now has some marching ants around it. It hides those marching ants by default. So you know that you have an active selection because these ants are moving here. So now I've got a white paintbrush, and because the highlights were not very bright in our preview there, I need to start with a fairly high opacity. So I'm going to go like 60% opacity. And now when I start to paint white through that luminosity selection, it's going to reveal the highlights of our brighter, warmer, more contrasty version of our photo. So as I start to paint through here, essentially we're painting with warmth, we're painting with brightness, we're painting with saturation, and I'm in full control over where this goes. So obviously we want to emphasize the dust on this tractor because that was the reason I chose this moment to photograph. I want to emphasize the highlights happening here kind of towards the center of our composition. But the cool thing is, and the powerful part of this technique is that we're in control over where this goes. So I'm obviously not going to go up here and start brightening up the highlights on the outside corners of our composition because we want to draw the eye deeper into the frame, not allow it to escape out the bottom. So I can choose how much we're going to brighten down here. I can choose how much we're going to brighten in our background. We don't need to bring that in as much as we don't need to bring it in all the way. And this is really the magic sauce of this technique, is that we're in full control over everything. We're in full control over where it goes. And if we decide that, you know what, like that base layer is a little bit over dark, I could double click on our base layer here, which was for our shadow information, which is again going to bring up Adobe Camera Raw. And then we can be like, okay, we overdid that whole darkness thing. Let's bring it up a little bit, maybe add a little contrast to it and hit okay. And because it's a smart object layer, nothing is baked in. So we can always go back and make little minor changes. So this technique is just dual processing a single raw file. And there's so many different ways of utilizing this. In this particular case, we're using it to really emphasize, like to really amp up contrast and to create more depth and dimension in an image. A lot of times I use this same technique to like mellow out a sky or to maybe like, I don't know, like recover highlights in a particular area. And that's going to be some of the techniques that I show you with your guys' raw files as well. Before we move on from this particular technique, do we have any questions that we should answer?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the demonstration there. And once again, I think it's the different things we haven't seen. Good questions about when would you not use a smart object?
So the things that you cannot do with a smart object is that you cannot free transform it. So for example, if you have a focus stacking situation, Photoshop does not have the ability to look at those different smart object layers and make them all line up to compensate for the focus breathing. Therefore, we can't focus stack a set of smart objects. That's like one of the biggest frustrations. If we could do that, you'd pretty much use a smart object all the time. So you can't free transform them, which means that if you're going to go in and do like a lot of like mountain stretching or something at the very beginning of workflow, which you shouldn't do for a bunch of different reasons. You can't do that with smart objects either. But the main thing is you can't focus stack them. Every other time I open stuff up as smart objects, even if it's multiple frames, and I bring them into one file and then I blend them together.
Great.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, that actually is, there's several questions along the same thread of how much work do you do in Lightroom before you go into Photoshop? That's a couple of the questions there, and then we got another one, but first and foremost on that one.
It kind of depends on the game plan. So like when I look at an image and I kind of have an idea for which direction I want to take it in post-processing, I typically get a game plan of some kind. So sometimes it's a really simple edit, doesn't need much other than like some contrast and then a little bit of like Photoshop magic. So in those situations, I do a fair bit of, global slider adjustments in Lightroom. Yeah. But if it's local adjustments, typically I save local adjustments for Photoshop, because Photoshop is so much more powerful in the way of, if I overdo something, I can fade it out, or I can throw a luminosity mask on it, or I can make a selection of that sky or those highlights or that rock or whatever, and make sure that adjustment only goes into the area that I want it to go into. So most of the time I do some basic slider adjustments. I get my color temperature and my colors the way I want them inside of Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and then I do the rest in Photoshop.
Great. One more question. We got a bunch more in here, but we'll keep packaging together. A couple questions about using less opacity and 100% flow. Is that something you usually do? And then another question kind of related to why you would adjust the opacity of your brush versus flow.
There you go. So the biggest difference, the best way to think about it is, first of all, I'm processing with a Wacom tablet, and that kind of changes the intuitiveness of it, right? So for me, if you're adjusting the amount of paint that you're applying with opacity, it functions like a brush, literally like a paintbrush. If you do a stroke, and then if you want to apply more paint, you have to do another stroke. But if you're doing it with flow, it functions more like a spray paint can. So if you're a mouse user and you want to click it and then just hold it down and it'll keep applying paint, that would be the effect of using flow to change how much paint you're applying. For me, because I'm using a Wacom tablet, it's just more intuitive to use opacity, because then it functions more like a brush. So opacity is like a paintbrush and flow is like a spray paint can. That's the best way to describe it.
Great description. All right, keep rolling.
All right. Share the screen again. All right. What was I going to talk about? All right. Next thing is one of the most useful techniques. See if I can. I hate it when Zoom covers half my lower part of my frame. One of the most useful techniques or ways to utilize luminosity masks and selections are with exposure blending. So for example, I have this image here. Let's go fix the white balance a little bit, where I couldn't quite, I probably could have got it all in one frame, but by exposing for essentially my shadow areas, I'm able to get super clean shadow information. And then by taking a darker image for our sky, we're able to get the full dynamic range of the scene in the highest possible quality. So the way that I would process, or the way that I would exposure blend these two images together, would be using a combination of a sky selection and luminosity masks, and I'll show you how. So first thing I want to do is let's just kind of get the bones of these two images looking right. When I'm exposing, or when I'm getting ready to exposure blend two images together, and I'm sure Sean's going to go over this as well. I think we do things slightly differently, but pretty close to the same. One of the things that I want to do is I want to kind of exposure match first. So if I go in and I try to exposure blend this foreground with this sky, it's going to look fake and cartoony every single time. And I'm likely going to end up with halos of some kind, simply because like when you have something this bright, you start getting these kind of semi-translucent edges, these kind of glowy edges, just as a result of the foreground being this bright. So one of the things that I need to do is do a little bit of exposure matching to bring it into the realm of believability. That way it blends more easily together for you. So for our foreground image, I'm going to lift my shadows and my blacks a fair bit, but then I'm going to bring down the exposure quite a bit. I still have all of my shadow information, but that sky is not so crazy, ridiculously bright compared to our foreground. I'm also going to recover our highlights a bit. I'm going to go down. One of the most important things you can do before you exposure blend is go to your lens corrections and make sure you remove chromatic aberrations, because chromatic aberrations are really apparent a lot of times in exposure blends. And for now, we'll just call that good. I'm going to go over to our dark frame here, remove chromatic aberrations in his as well, get the white balance looking right, add a little contrast. Mostly, I want to show you the technique more than try to make a perfect image here. So something like this, we'll call that good. But you see how in our sky frame here, I'm able to add quite a bit of contrast because we don't need any of this foreground. And in our foreground image, I've left it, well, let's warm it up a little bit more. I've left it fairly dark. That way it's a believable dynamic range difference from that bright sky. So at this point, I'm going to select them both. I'm going to right click, go edit in, open as smart object in Photoshop. So this is going to, because Photoshop and Lightroom are kind of stupid, it's going to open them up into separate files, and then we have to combine them into one file. TK Actions has a button for it. This way to do it without TK Actions is simply grab the Move tool, grab the layer, go down here to the Layers tab, hold down Shift and click on it, and then just drag it over to the other image and let go. So now they're both right here, one on top of the other. So at this point, one of the most important things we got to do here before we attempt to exposure blend is zoom way in on our details and then turn the layers off and on and make sure things line up perfectly. If you have any movement, you're going to see a little bit of movement. It looks like things move just the tiniest bit here. So a quick little tip for lining things up quickly is we'll change the blend mode of this top layer to difference. And when I do that, we're going to get these halos anywhere where things are not perfectly lined up. So it looks like if I push this with my move tool, I've got my move tool selected and I'm going to just use my arrow keys. And if we go like, we can kind of try to get that halo looking as small as we can get it. So it looks like that is about as good as we're going to be able to do. So I just moved it to where I got the halo looking as small and insignificant as I could. If it's big like that, you're going to end up with weird artifacts when you exposure blend. That's about as good as we can do. And on the pixel level, that's not bad, honestly. So I'm going to change the blend mode back to normal before we start. So we have our dark sky on top and our brighter foreground on the bottom. The way that I personally like to do this is because we have this new sky selection available to us in Photoshop. What I can do is I can go up to, well, first of all, we're going to put a black layer mask on this layer. So I'm going to hit Alt and click on New Layer Mask. That way our dark sky layer has been hidden 100%. Now what we can do is go up to Select Sky. And it's going to look at our image and it's going to do its best to make a selection of this sky. A lot of times it does a okay job, but there's almost always some artifacts as a result simply because it doesn't do a perfect job. So what I like to do is I make this initial selection of our sky. That way I don't accidentally create some halos. But then afterwards, I'm going to go in and I'm going to finish using a luminosity mask. So we've got this sky selection active. We've got our marching ants, which means I can use it like a stencil, right? So I'm going to hide my marching ants by going Control or Command H for hide. I'm going to grab a paintbrush. I'm going to change to white, and I'm going to go 100% opacity, 100% flow. So we're going to click on our layer mask here, and I'm going to start at the very top of the frame and just start bringing it in. And you can see that because these two frames are not so crazy different in brightness level, especially after we recovered the highlights in that in the foreground image, it's pretty easy to blend these two together. But where things are not perfect, or where they're likely to not be perfect, are going to be in areas of transition zone, which we're lucky to not have too much of in this image, but also areas around brightest highlights. So a lot of times you're going to create artifacts by just using a sky selection like this. So at this point, I'm going to stop using the sky selection, which means I need to unselect it. And you do that by going Control or Command D for deselect. And now what we can do is we can go into TK actions, and we can try to find a luminosity mask that's going to allow us to finish this exposure blend by making a selection of those brightest highlights. So right now, this is just a lights one luminosity mask. And you can see that some of these rock areas are kind of gray, which means it would allow my paint to go into these areas, and that's not what we want. So what we can try is let's go to a lights 2, and you can see it does a really good job here, although some of these cloudy areas, it's not selected enough. So this is going to be our first opportunity to modify a luminosity mask or a luminosity selection. And we do that with these buttons here, these gray, kind of light gray buttons. So in this case, if we think about what we're trying to achieve here, ideally, I want our sky very bright, but we want these rock formations black. That way our paint cannot go into them. And if I start with a lights 2, I think that that's too dark to start off with. So I'm going to start with a lights 1, and then let's click on this levels adjustment here. So this is going to allow me to add contrast to this luminosity mask or selection. So by grabbing this black point and moving it right, you can see the rock formations are getting very dark. And we can sit here and rock our contrast back and forth to where our rock formation remains black, but those clouds get pretty bright. And all we need really is here and here, kind of in these cracks. And as long as the areas around those areas, as far as the rock formations, stay very dark, we're good. So what I need to do now is let's make a selection of this, because we're going to load it as a stencil. And we do that with this marching ants button here. So now we've loaded that as our active selection, which means it's going to function like a stencil. I can go 100% opacity, 100% flow, and then just use that to bring in that sky the rest of the way. You can see what would have happened if I wouldn't have brought that sky in the rest of the way. There's like some weird ghosting artifacts where these clouds were moving and they get doubled, and you don't want that. If those clouds wouldn't have been part of this selection, we would have ended up with some kind of funky sky artifacts here. So I'm just going around this edge and using that active selection to finish this blend. So I can do it in this view, or I can hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and click on our layer mask button. And it gives us this view where we can really see what our layer mask looks like. We can see areas where we may have over darkened our rock formation. And that's what happens a lot of times with those sky selections. So in that case, I can deselect my current selection, and we can tweak this. We can tweak this by going up and changing the blend mode of our brush to overlay. So that's going to essentially only allow the paint to go into either, if I have white selected, it's going to allow me to brighten any pixel that is 50% bright or 50% gray or brighter. But if I have black selected, it's only going to allow my paint to go into areas that are 50% gray or darker. So for example, here, if I just do one brush stroke, you can see that it did not go into the sky. I'll do that again, but it allowed me to darken these highlights on the rocks here. So in this way, I can kind of go and I can finish and clean up any areas where we accidentally darkened our rock formation here. And then we can click on our layer here as we do that and make sure that we're not creating any strangeness, but that's pretty much it. So kind of going back before, after, we blended those two different exposures together. We started off with a sky selection. That way it essentially functioned like a stencil, but because it was not a perfect stencil, it was not a perfect selection of that sky. Before we got too close to these edges, we abandoned it and we finished it off with a luminosity mask that would do a better job of making a selection of those highlights and not allowing our paint to go into the sky. And we could also use, let's say we created a strange dark halo somewhere. We didn't really, but if there was like some kind of really strange dark halo, we could also go and target that dark halo with a darks luminosity mask. So as I toggle through these darks 4, darks 5, it'll reach a point where the rocks are very selected, but the sky is 100% not selected. We can make a selection of that. And then we could go back over our layer mask, this time with black, and just touch up any areas where maybe we created a slight dark halo around these edges. And that is how you exposure blend. It's always interesting. I'll stop sharing here. It's always interesting, especially for those of you that are going to watch Sean's presentation, to see the differences between how I do it and how he does it. Everybody does it a little different, all working towards the same goal. And that's kind of the thing to remember with all of this, is that it's not so much the how, it's the why. Like, what are you trying to achieve with these techniques? Because there's always more than one way to skin a cat, especially the more you learn Photoshop. Like, you could do things a million different ways, but it's more about why are you doing that? So in this case, we're trying to like even out the dynamic range, and then we've got some other stuff coming up. But yeah, hopefully I'm hammering the home the why. Why would you use luminosity masks? Because they're an awesome selection or mask to really target and only to affect the tones that you want to affect.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of comments in there. There's been a lot of questions as well, some of which I've been answering about why would we use, which you'll continue to go through, why would we use Photoshop versus Lightroom for luminosity masks in particular? So you're continuing to do that. A couple questions related to why didn't you use auto align?
Yeah, so auto align sucks. Simple as that. Photoshop does a decent job with alignment, but when it comes to exposure blending, things have to be perfect. And that's why we spend as much money on tripods as we do. Like, things have to be perfectly lined up. Otherwise, there's going to be a bright halo or a dark halo. There's no getting around it. If it's perfect, there can be no halo. Sometimes when it's perfect, there's still a halo. But that's why, is because Photoshop goes in and it literally warps the image to try to line stuff up. And so it's not always looking at that horizon line. It might be looking at a rock in the foreground and aligning stuff there perfectly there, but not the horizon. So don't let Photoshop auto align your stuff.
I speak from experience for night photography, which I'm nowhere near as good as Nick Page, but you have to mask everything off and then go through each individual mask and mask them off so you can tell it exactly where to look if you want to align your sky. Ooh, major pain.
Yeah.
So, Paul had a good question though. Why use both a sky selection and a luminosity mask rather than just a luminosity mask? So people are paying attention, Nick.
That's good. And that's a good thing. So in the past, I've just not used sky selections, but the nice part of a sky selection is that you notice how I start that exposure blend by starting at the top and bringing it in 100%. You have to start the exposure blend with no luminosity mask. And the reason for that is because typically in a grand landscape, you have bright highlights in your sky, but you also have some of the dark clouds. And if you start with a luminosity selection or mask, it's going to mask out some of those dark clouds, and you're going to end up with a really flat, weird result in your sky. So I always start with no selection at all, or at least a sky selection that allow my paint to come in all the way up in the top portion of the frame. And then as I get close to that horizon line where I need some help, that's when I go and I grab a luminosity mask, because close to the horizon line, I can no longer Rembrandt that thing in, and a sky selection is not perfect enough. So that's when I get close to that horizon line, that's when I grab a luminosity mask or selection.
Great. All right, keep going. We got other questions, but I know we got a lot of good images to demo.
Right. And also the reason I'm going fast is because it is recorded. So that makes the recording more content rich.
Exactly.
All right. Sharing screen. So let's go here. So there was so many great images that came in here. One of the, let's see here. Let me think about what I want to do next. Whoever took these images, they're so good. I don't know who you are, man, but I'm jealous of your images. Like, just the amount of detail in these images are absolutely excellent. Again, this is one of those overlook photos where the raw file is fairly flat, but what we can do in post-processing is bring out a lot of that depth and dimension, and we can kind of go through and create a little bit of color separation as well. Remember, depth is created not only by the difference between highlight and shadow, but also the difference between warmth and coldness, or warm and cold. So one of the things that we can do is we can use that same kind of dual processing technique, but we can use that to not only work a little bit of coolness into the shadows, but warmth into the highlights, and create even more depth and dimension and visual flow in this image. So I'm going to open this up as a smart object. Before I do, let's go ahead and process this just a little bit with the shadow areas in mind. So I'm going to go a little bit cold, somewhere in here probably. And a little tip here is that typically you can get away with more sharpening and more sharpening in your shadows than you can in your highlights. And that's one of the things that I like to do is in my sharpening or detail section, I increase the detail all the way. But because I know this is going into the shadow areas, I'm going to increase the amount. And we'll have to remember that we did that. But essentially, I want to sharpen the shadows more. And that just helps them be dark, but detailed. Dark and detailed is always kind of what I'm going for shadows. So this is going to be kind of our palette that we're going to start with. Now I'm going to right click, edit in, open as a smart object in Photoshop. So again, we're opening this as a smart object. Let's close a couple of these other files just so my computer doesn't hate me. Okay. So we've got our dark and detailed for our shadow areas. I'm going to right click on this, new smart object via copy like we did before. And now this time we're going to really process this with the kind of the ridges and some of the warm areas in the valley in mind. So we're going to decrease shadows, decrease blacks, increase contrast, bring up exposure, and bring up warmth. Something like this. And I'm even going to add a little bit of extra saturation to this. So I'm going to go down to the camera calibration tab and increase the saturation of the blue primary just to give it a little help for saturation purposes. And we're going to go to the detail tab and remove some of that sharpening here. Just decrease it a bit so we're not, because typically you don't want to sharpen too much right off the bat. I always save the bulk of the sharpening for the final step. That way it's not like baked in. So you can see, like, if we just did this all with global adjustments, you can see that there's not a lot of visual flow because there's just detail and highlights everywhere. So you create visual flow by being in control over highlights. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to draw the eye into this valley. This ridge is awesome. This ridge is awesome. This ridge is awesome. But back here, these highlights are a little bit of a distraction. So we're going to try to downplay those. So that's kind of the game plan here. Going to put a black layer mask on it. And now let's go and let's create a luminosity mask that's going to target these ridges a little bit. Now, remember, these ridges were a little bit warmer than the shadow areas. So in TK Actions, another thing that we can do is we can base our luminosity masks off different channels. So right now, this is just like a black and white version of our photo. But if we created a black and white version of our photo based on the yellow channel, it gives us a little bit more of a selection. Let's try red. Okay, let's just go yellow. It's just because those areas will be a little bit more selected. And remember, we can also modify our luminosity selection or mask with these buttons here. So I'm going to grab a levels adjustment and then just grab this right slider and bring it a little bit left, and then grab the midtone slider and bring it a little bit right. That way we're just brightening it up a little bit and adding a bit of contrast. So it doesn't take for absolutely ever for our paint to come through. So something like this. So now we're going to make a selection of it, which loads it like a stencil. We can tell it's loaded because we got the marching ants around TK8. We're going to grab a paintbrush. We're going to switch to white. Oops, we're going to switch to white here. And now with a 50% opacity brush, we're going to start painting with light here. So definitely want to emphasize this ridge. And I'm going to do this effect more in the part of the photo that I really want to draw attention to. You can't do it like only in that part. You kind of have to like work the light in other places as well. Otherwise it starts looking a little hokey. But hopefully you can see the amount of depth and control that we have here. We can emphasize the light streaming in on the right side of this ridge. We can do the same back here. And it's just a beautiful way of bringing out a lot of dimension and making things feel three-dimensional again. Because one of the biggest weaknesses of our cameras is that they see things in a very two-dimensional way. And we as humans, we have the ability to view things through the parallax effect where, you know, we can move our head side to side and we can see things in 3D. And in my opinion, one of the most important things we can do in post-processing is to try to bring back some of that dimensionality again. So that's why I'm adding this effect more on the right side of this ridge than the left, because I want this side to be catching the light a bit more than this side. And it makes it feel very three-dimensional. I'm not increasing the highlights in these corners as much, but mostly deeper into the frame. If I hold down Alt and look at our layer mask, you can see that I was in control over where it went by where I chose to paint, but it's still controlling which tones are being revealed. So before that effect, after that effect. It's looking a little bit fake over here, so we'll just add a little bit more and something like that. So you can see how powerful this can be. Obviously, I might be overdoing it, you know, for your taste, but it's just a tool to have in the toolbox. And you can have so much fun with this. You can create a lot of color separation. Like if we double click on our base layer and cool it down even more, you can see how much two-tone kind of split toning effect we can get. I cooled down the color temperature that even more. And now those shadows are very cold, but the highlights are very warm. If we decide that we want more of this effect or we want to kind of bleed them together a bit more, something else that you can do is you can right click, or I mean, you can double click on the layer mask, and that brings up your density and your feather slider. And if we grab this density slider and drag it left, if I go all the way left, you can see it changes that, it gets rid of the blacks essentially. But if you look at this layer mask and I slide this to the right, you can kind of see what happens. It allows the blacks to get, so all the way to the right, the blacks go all the way to black. As I slide this to the left, the blacks can no longer quite reach black. And so the result of that is that it kind of bleeds these images together a little bit. It allows this to shine through more in the shadow areas, or the areas that were not part of that layer mask. So this is this technique. It's really, really powerful for bringing dimension through. It's kind of something I showed earlier. Something else that I want to touch on is a really useful way of adding contrast in kind of an automated way without allowing anything to clip. So for example, if we wanted to really emphasize some of the highlight depth in the center portion of this photo here, one of the things that we can do is we can create a luminosity mask, and not a luminosity mask, I'm sorry. We're going to create a levels adjustment, sorry. And so we've got this levels adjustment here. Now, normally with a levels adjustment, you slide your sliders around, and that's kind of how you create your contrast. But there's another way of doing it. You can hold down Alt or Option and click on this Auto button. And this gives you some automated things that it can do. And one of the things that it can do that's a really nice effect is if you go to Enhance Monochromatic Contrast. And what this does is it essentially adds a whole bunch of contrast without allowing anything to go all the way to white or all the way to black. Now, when we do this effect, you can see that like it's really harsh in the shadow areas, but it has kind of a nice effect in the highlight areas. So what we can do is throw a light swing luminosity mask on this and allow that contrast adjustment to only go into the highlight areas. So in the past, we've been hitting the selection button. This time we're going to hit the mask button. And that's going to apply this black and white version of our photo to this levels adjustment. That way, this contrast adjustment only goes into those highlights. A lot of times, this is a pretty strong effect, so we can just back it off. And so I'll back this off to like 50%. And why I like that particular contrast adjustment is because it's a really quick and easy way of adding a bunch of contrast with knowing that nothing is going to get blown out. So yeah, that's one of my favorite techniques right there. Questions thus far? I'm guessing there might be one or two.
Well, unfortunately, people are paying attention. So, which means we have lots of questions and lots of good comments, lots of compliments about Jeff's image as well. And a couple questions of why do you increase the saturation in the blue channel? Why do you increase saturation in blue only? Also related, somewhere in here was another question related to the blues. So talk a little bit about that. Why it's there.
It's just a taste thing. Like through playing with the different, adding saturation through the red primary, the blue primary, and the green primary, I find that when I add saturation in the green primary, it kind of shifts everything towards kind of a cyany teal. It plays with color tone a little bit. I get the best effect by increasing either the blue or the red. Sometimes I'll do red, but usually what I do is I try to pick the channel that isn't very represented in the image. So if I have a sky that has a bunch of blue in it, and then I increase the blue primary slider, it's going to go nuclear blue. So a lot of times in that case, I'll increase the red primary. But because all the channels are interconnected, you're increasing the saturation of the whole image with a bias towards whichever channel you select. So typically I just brainlessly go to blue.
Yeah,
but
I do the same thing. So
yeah, but yeah. Red gets a similar effect. I don't like the effect of green typically.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the three camera channels and the blue in terms of what the landscape brings back. And I've tried it on other images. It doesn't look as good.
Right.
So, so this is a good question. You're going back to your auto align thing. Should auto align also be skipped in focus stacking in Photoshop?
No, that in that case, if I'm doing a focus stack, I'm not meticulous enough to go through and to manually try to transform things. So if I'm doing a focus stack, I will do an auto align. Sometimes I will manually blend a focus stack because auto blend doesn't always work great. But a lot of times I will do it auto blend and then auto align, then manually blend, just simply because Photoshop can do a better job with foregrounds than I can.
Okay, great. All right, keep going.
All right. Yes, sir. Okay. So another thing that I really like to do, especially in an image where we have lots of sharp details, like this image, you can see that it's developing a lot of micro contrasts. And a lot of that is nice, but one of the things that helps with a sense of atmosphere is to soften some of those micro contrasts. And the way that I prefer to do that is through Orton effects. So included in this is I'm giving you guys 3 different actions. One is this contrast action, but also I'm throwing in my Orton effect action and like a background haze action. So the Orton effect that I like to do, and we'll just quickly do this.
I'll just say real quick, those will be included as a link with the emails. And also for those of you that subscribe to the whole series, they'll be in your library to be able to download those. So yeah, be in there. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, no problem. So the way I do an Orton effect, and it can be done many different ways, but essentially I do it to all of my images just because I'm addicted to the effect, is I create a merge visible layer. So that's just the current state of your photo on its own pixel layer. That way you have pixels to blur. So I do that by going Control Shift Alt E or Command Option Shift E on a Mac. That gives me this layer here. Then I go up and I blur it. So I go up to Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I blur this somewhere around the pixel radius of the camera. So somewhere between 40 and 60. So in this case, we'll go 49, hit OK. And now I decrease the opacity of this layer down somewhere around 20%. But and at this point, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's blurring the highlights into the shadows, but unfortunately, it's also blurring the shadows into the highlights. And so what we want to do is we want the highlights to glow, but not necessarily the shadows. We want more of this effect in highlights, less in shadows. So for that reason, we're going to throw a Lights 1 luminosity mask on it. So I'm creating a Lights 1 and then creating a layer mask. So we've literally got this as its layer mask on this blurred layer. Now, the next thing that we need to do, though, is we need to kind of spice up those highlights. That way they glow. And I want them to glow a little bit more with more warmth. Overall, this image is pretty cold. So let's warm it up as well during this step. So I'm going to go click on my blurred layer, go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. And in Adobe Camera Raw, we're going to add contrast, lots of contrast. We're going to brighten it up. That way those highlights are brighter and glowier. But we're also going to warm it up considerably. And remember that because we have that luminosity mask attached to it, these highlights, they're going to get kind of washed out because they're brighter, but this effect is only going to go into those highlights. So let's go ahead and add just a little bit of vibrance and saturation to this as well and hit OK. So at this lower opacity, it's a subtle effect before, after. So if I'll amp it up more than I would, just so you guys can see it over the webinar, before, after. Those highlights just take on a bit of glow. It kind of gives that feeling like, you know, if you have daylight hitting a reflective surface, they create a bunch of specular highlights and those highlights kind of shine and they kind of glow. This is kind of mimicking that. So this is an effect that I do on most of my images. I don't always do it very much, but I always do it at least a little bit, just because it just gives it a feeling that you can't really get with everything just being tack sharp and very contrasty. So it's a way of kind of giving that sense of atmosphere and that sense of daylight back. So yeah.
So in terms of the action, do you have it loaded that you could show what it does for people and what they still need to do?
Yeah. So let's say I'll delete this Orton effect. When you get the action, you'll go up to your actions panel here. And then right here, Nick Page Orton, I'll click on that and I'll hit play. And then literally it just does it. And granted, it's going to do it more tastefully than I just did it, but it's very similar. So there you go. It goes through, creates a merge visible layer, Gaussian blur, creates a selection, applies it as a mask. It does all of the steps we just did, only with the click of a button. It's really easy to get addicted to these, but one of the things that I highly recommend is that, like, if you do see someone else's actions, reverse engineer it a bit and kind of put your own spin on some of these effects. Just because I do it this amount doesn't mean you have to do it this amount. Maybe you can find a better way to do it, and it can kind of be your thing, you know? I know I've never seen anybody do it quite the way that I do it. And for that reason, it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside because I feel like I was almost original.
Yeah. Well, if you want, we can call it Nick Page's super special Orton to make you feel better. So
but you have to kind of slur them. It's super special.
Super special Nick Page.
Yeah.
Great.
My retainer.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Beautiful image. Whoever took this, Jeff, who was that? Jeff Francis?
Yep.
Awesome image. So let's see. Another thing. Let's do.
Well, there's been a couple actually 2 requests on any sort of God beam enhancement or soft and dreamy looking forest scenes or light enhancement techniques as well. So I know we got a lot of stuff to pick from. So
okay, so there's a couple techniques around that I want to show. Let's see. With this image, I'm going to show one of the things that I like to do is it's a very similar dodge burn layer, but it's dodging and burning through a blurred or a feathered selection. That way you're actually enhancing daylight glow. So straight out of camera, obviously tons of atmosphere, tons of haze. And one of the first things that a lot of people do is they grab this dehaze slider and crank it to the right. Don't ever do that. We're going to do that. We're going to create contrast without that. So I'm going to process this with the shadows in mind. So we're going to add some contrast, try to neutralize that blue haze at least a little bit, something like this, bring down the exposure. And then at this point, I'm just going to hit, right, edit in, open a smart object in Photoshop. Now in this one, what I want to do is we're going to, and it's kind of my post-processing philosophy, is I like to start with that dark canvas. That way you're in control over where the eye is going to go, because you're kind of everything you accentuate from here on out is going to be an eye magnet, right? So by starting dark, basically all that's left is to bring in highlights. So we're going to do that, only this time rather than duplicating the smart object, I'm just going to create a new dodge burn layer, which is just a new layer, blend mode change to soft light. But what we're going to do differently this time is that we're going to put a luminosity mask on it. And in this situation, I want it to be a very contrasty luminosity mask where only these bright highlights where the daylight is hitting is part of the selection. So let's try a lights 2. It's just a little too contrasty. So we're going to start with a lights 1. We're going to modify it by dragging this left slider to the right, right slider left. And I want this really, really contrasty. That way, only the daylight pretty much is part of the selection. So something like this. Now I'm going to apply that as a layer mask with the layer mask button. So we've got this very contrasty layer mask right here, but we're not going to use this layer mask. This is here purely for storage. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click on this layer. We're going to grab this feather slider and drag it to the right. Now, as I do this, essentially, this is just a blur slider. So if I take it way right, it gets very blurry. And what's cool about this is it's totally non-destructive. You can go back and redo it if you need it. But what I want to do here is I'm going to create this kind of blurred version of this luminosity selection. So something like this, where it's got a fair amount of blur, but not too much. And then we're going to hold down Control and click on that layer mask. So we're going to get some marching ants. When you hold down Control, that is essentially going to load this as an active selection. You can do that on any channel, any layer mask, pretty much any layer. If you hold down Control and click on it, it loads it as a selection. So, but what we need to do now is I'm going to hold down Shift and click on this layer mask. And you see this red X that deactivates this layer mask. So we created the layer mask, we blurred it, we selected it, and then we deactivated it, meaning that it's not functioning like a layer mask because it's only there for storage purposes. If we need to re-access it, we can. I'm going to hide the marching ants. We've got that blurred selection active. I'm going to sample this color that's happening. It's kind of this warm, daylighty orange. And now with like a 40% opacity brush, I'm going to start dodging on these mountain peaks. Now what's going to happen is because our selection is blurred, what we paint is essentially going to glow. This is like a very localized effect where when we paint this through, this daylight is going to feel a bit more glowy before, after. And we're going to purposely overdo this layer because when I get done with all this, we're going to reactivate that layer mask. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous amount of steps, but what's nice is that we're painting through this blurred layer. So it's kind of fading into those shadows a bit because that's all a glow is it's spilling over the edges into the shadows. So the daylight is spreading over into those shadows. We're going to overdo this just a little bit and then reactivate that layer mask by clicking on it. And now we just have this really nice kind of glowy daylight effect. When we reactivate that, it's pretty restrictive. So what we can do is just duplicate this layer a couple times. 1, 2. 2 is too many, and it didn't duplicate the layer mask. So because it didn't duplicate the layer mask, I can hold down Control and click on it, click on that layer, hit layer mask. Now they're both restricted to those areas. So this is a useful technique for kind of dodging through a blurred selection. And it's a really powerful technique in the right circumstances. Not always, but sometimes. And then obviously we could go through and add a bit more contrast. Let's go and brighten things up a bit. Then I would paint this into the foreground here. You guys get the idea before, after. And I would try to even out the tonality because I kind of like these hazy shadows back here, but if we wanted to bring a little bit more definition into this background, what we could do is just do burning through a selection. So we'll create a new layer, change the blend mode to soft light. And this time, let's just make a selection of those deepest shadows. So let's try a lights or a darks 1, not nearly selective enough. Darks 2, not selective enough. Darks 4, it's getting close. So let's try a darks 4. And I'm going to select that. So we've just loaded this as an active selection. We're going to grab just a very neutral dark color, 20% opacity, and we'll just do a few passes of this in the areas that are the most hazy. And that's just going to help essentially darken some of those deepest shadows and bring a little bit more dimension into the shadows, cut through that haze a bit. You got to be careful anytime you're burning. So dodging is brightening, burning is darkening. When I find that burning is much more touchy. You got to be careful with it. So a lot of times I'll do it and then it looks overdone. And then I always back off the opacity of that layer just a bit because I almost always find that I overdid it. So, yep, that's that technique. What the takeaway from this is that painting through that blurred selection is a really nice way to emphasize daylight. So, yeah.
Before and after on that one.
Oh, yeah. So let me go back here, share again. Sorry. Okay. Before, well,
it looks pretty dark. Hold on. I don't know if I'm not seeing your screen right now. I don't know if I'm the only one. But...
Oh, you're not?
Mm-mm.
Are you not? Are you yet? Oh,
no.
How about now? Huh?
No.
Let's stop sharing.
Black screen. I'm not the only one.
How about now? Bueller?
Yeah, it's saying Nick Page has started screen sharing, and that's it.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
I don't know.
Let's take a question then.
Let's take a question and give them a second to figure out what it's doing. So let's talk a little bit about the deactivation, reactivation of the max of the red X and deactivating the layer. Why did you do that?
Right. So the reason I deactivated it is that way I can really see how much of the effect I'm painting in. So by deactivating it, it allows more of the effect to go through and it doesn't take as long essentially. And sometimes I leave it deactivated. Other times, like this one, if I find that it's just over the top and overdone, then I reactivate it, which restricts it to only that original luminosity mask and it dials it back. So it's just a way of kind of having two different options there. Sometimes I use it and sometimes I don't. Can you see my screen?
No, I'm going to share my screen for one quick second and see if it'll break Zoom out.
Yeah, yours. Oh, there it goes.
Okay. All right. We'll give a second. We got a couple more questions anyways. Well, we don't want to get into it, still black, but what Wacom tablet do you prefer? I think it's actually applicable because you're very Wacom-y. So
yeah, I'm very Wacom-y. It's a Intuos Medium Pro.
Okay. Intuos Medium Pro for those of you following along at home. So great. And then let's see. So a couple questions on, and we'll kind of get, as we're working back through this, a good time. You use both TK and Lumenzia. Is there a period of time, and I know we're using TK primarily for this series, where you would use Lumenzia over TK, or just based on, you know?
Well, usually, like, what I like about Lumenzia is that the interface never changes. So for that reason, like, people just dipping their toe in the luminosity mask. It's kind of a comfortable place to start because you learn it once. It's also got some free tutorials. So for beginners, it's kind of nice. For my personal use, it's just got a couple functions that are slightly different. Like, you can modify a luminosity mask based on color a little bit more easily. So it basically gives you a color mixer channel, and you can be like, okay, deselect the blues all the way and select the yellows a lot, and do that kind of thing. And it's useful sometimes, but basically you can do the exact same thing with both. TK Actions is more powerful. But it's just maybe a little bit more daunting to learn in the beginning.
Yeah. So with Sean's session in a couple of weeks, we'll see some of the use of some of these action shortcuts and other things. And then he's also going to give you a free tutorial on some of the other things too. So you'll see the things, and I'll probably do a Lumenzia class in the future with bring Greg on and do something. And then one more question, and then hopefully we'll, fingers crossed, have the screen share working. So where to go? Sorry. Can any of these techniques be used for night skies or more just for foregrounds? So like what?
Yes, absolutely. Like one of the things I do quite often is I dual process night sky images. And it's really nice because a lot of times your sky requires contrast to make the Milky Way pop or whatever it is that you're photographing. but that same contrast will destroy a foreground. That, and you can get away with different amounts of noise reduction in different parts. So it's really nice for night sky images for that reason, because a lot of times, you know, in a lot of wide angle photography, skies benefit from contrast, but foregrounds not necessarily.
Yeah.
So it's nice for controlling that.
Okay. Well, we still can't see your screen, unfortunately.
Okay.
So
I wonder.
I thought this was supposed to be professional hour, not amateur hour.
Right?
Yeah.
I wonder if I need to like leave and come back.
Okay.
It's a dangerous thing to do, I know, but
yeah, if you're gonna leave and come back, I'll I have something I can share and talk briefly about in that period.
I'll be quick. I'm literally going to hit the leave button and then come back.
All right.
But I wonder if I need to close Zoom down all the way.
Well, if you do, that's fine. We'll restart. I'm gonna share. I'll share this thing I want to talk about anyways, and then we will go from there. So we'll see you back.
All right. So back after these special
this
messages.
commercial break inspired by.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Hopefully I come back.
Exactly. So, all right, guys. So some of you are completely new. This is the first time we've spent any time together at all. Some of you have been with me for several years, if not longer. But I just announced this on, what is today? Thursday? I announced this on Monday, and it's called the Inspired Creator. So it's something I've wanted to do both through the speaker series and also through a lot of the other work that I've been doing. And that is really giving back into the greater population of people that are really inspired to bring forth projects or ideas. So for this year and starting in April, I'll be awarding $10,000. Yes, that was a real number, not to one individual, but to a series of different projects or causes of things that people are actually working on. So the cool thing about this, it can go towards a particular cause, and I'll send information about this, of preservation of space or place. It can go towards preservation of what I call person or purpose. So if you have a special project that you yourself want to kind of bring to the forefront, but could use a little bit of extra money, potentially a little bit of extra mentoring or whatever else, this is part of what's out there for you guys. So the application information, all the stuff is in here. I'll email it out. Literally, if you're 12 years old or 81 years old, it doesn't matter. If you're professional or amateur, minimum award is 100, maximum award is 4,000, up to a total amount of $10,000. And this is a direct result of these types of programs and what we've been able to give back. So hopefully we can see some of you applying. I got a couple applications in already. I'll be reviewing these with Sarah Marino and Eric Bennett are going to kind of run shotgun with me on the Inspired Creator. So really exciting. And with that, the infomercial is over, and hopefully Mr. Page is sharing. So
moment of truth. Let's see it. Okay. Huh?
Yes. Oh, phew.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. All right, back to it.
This same thing happened to Enrico Fossati. So I guess I don't feel as bad. All right. So in the previous couple images, we've tried to really enhance depth and increase the dynamic range by selecting highlights and brightening them and darkening shadows. This is the opposite use case. Beautiful image, but high dynamic range scene, and actually really well exposed. This is a perfect exposure. You did a great job of getting the brightest highlights and just exposing for that. So this is a perfect use case for dual processing, only this time it's to mellow out the dynamic range. So essentially this is going to be like an exposure blend only from one raw file. And the way that I prefer to do that is I have already opened this as a smart object. We're going to start off by processing this once for the shadow areas, and then we're going to process it once for the highlight areas in the sky. So like I mentioned in the other image, we try to process this in a realistic dynamic range type way. So we don't want to go too bright because, these rocks will never blend great with a sky if they are this bright. So I want to lift these shadows and lift the black point to where we have detail and interest in here and definition, but we don't want it to be distracting either. And we don't want it to be so bright that we start getting halos around these trees. I know from experience that trees are where trees are always going to be where an exposure blend fails if it's going to fail. So in the shadow version of the image, what I'm going to do is lift the shadows, lift the black point, but I'm also going to recover highlights quite a bit. Something like this, to where, you know, it's almost good enough. You see images like this all the time, but I know that this sky is going to be much more beautiful if we process it once with the sky in mind separately, where we can actually add contrast to it rather than make it flat and lifeless. So we'll get this looking about right. And normally I would go through and I would tweak my sharpening settings and all of that, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. So we'll hit OK. So we've lifted our shadows. We have plenty of shadow information. I should have removed chromatic aberrations, but I didn't. So we'll see if we have to pay the price for that. Now I'm going to create a new smart object via copy by right-clicking on the title of the layer and duplicating it. And now this is going to be the sky version of the photo. So I'm going to actually, I like the color temperature. We're going to increase contrast, reset our highlights, reset our shadows. Actually, we'll bring shadows down a bit and then bring down the exposure to where we have like a nice contrast in that sky, but it's not way darker than the original version was. We want this to be as bright as we can get it without blowing out any highlights that are crucial. And then we'll hit OK. So you can see these two skies, the skies themselves, not so different. The difference is really the shadow information areas. And really the trick is to not over open these shadows because they're not crucial to this composition anyways. They're more a kind of a border, you know, a framing for the highlights in this image. So we're going to put a black layer mask on here. And we're going to start at the top of the frame with a white paintbrush, 100% opacity. And we'll start up here. And you can see that as I start to paint here, it's not a massive change. That's an important thing. That's a good thing. And if we feel maybe I can darken this a bit more, we'll see. But it's not a massive change before, after. Essentially, it's just allowing those clouds to be a bit more dramatic. I'm going to actually, this is the beauty of dual processing. I'm going to double click our top smart object. And we'll go ahead and add a bit more drama to the sky. But rather than bringing the brightness of the entire, or bringing the exposure down of the entire sky, I'm going to create a linear gradient. And I'm going to bring down the exposure with it. That way that effect fades out by the time it gets to our horizon line. A little bit of a gradient in the sky is a beautiful thing because it restricts the eye from escaping out the top of the frame. So I'm going to hit OK. And that is going to create a little bit more drama in the sky, but it's also going to give us a purpose for our luminosity mask because it was so similar that it was going to be too easy, and we can't be having that. So we've pretty much brought in our sky, but now we've created purposefully these halos close to the edges here. So I'm getting as close as I dare to the horizon line and these trees. Now that we've gotten this far, what we're going to go do is we're going to create a luminosity mask that's going to target that. So if you remember, there's a lot of blue in that sky, but everything, you know, below the sky is kind of green and warm. So we're going to create our luminosity mask based on the blue channel, and that should help at least a little bit. Let's try cyan. Yeah, blue. And the trick here is to create a luminosity mask that's going to limit how much we can go into our foreground, but still have that sky fairly selected. And we don't want to add too much contrast, or else we're going to end up with weird artifacts in these tree limbs. So I'm going to grab a levels adjustment here, and we're going to modify this mask just a little bit. Don't want to go overboard because we need to darken some of the the edges of those limbs just to eliminate the halos that will be created otherwise. So with this luminosity selection looking like this, or luminosity mask looking like this, we're going to make a selection of it. We're going to load it as a selection. And now with a 80% opacity brush, I'm going to go in and we'll do a couple passes in this area. And where I really need to be careful is around these grasses and stuff, because these grasses are part of that selection. So we're going to do all the easy stuff first. These bushes are dark, so I don't really have to worry about those. I'm going to lower my opacity and get in here. And the trick is to not do too many passes where I accidentally go, and go over this grass, because that grass is going to be part of that selection, which means it can be darkened. And if that grass gets too dark, then people can tell that it's exposure blended, and then Nick gets hate mail. We don't want hate mail. Can't give the trolls any ammunition. So that's what we do. We create that halo by painting down towards the horizon, but not going to the horizon. And then we finish the exposure blend with a luminosity selection. So this lighthouse is white, which means that we're going to have to be very careful around it as well. The shadow side is likely not really part of the selection, so we don't have to be too careful. But the highlight side is definitely going to be part of that selection, so we're going to have to be careful there. And when you're doing these exposure blends, all that really matters is how the final result looks, not so much how your layer mask looks. A lot of times it's really tempting to just like look at it in this view and think, oh my God, I suck. But as long as the final result looks believable, you're good. So you need to be looking at it in this view, because the final result is what matters, not your layer mask. And because we did some exposure matching before we even got started with this, we kind of made things easier on ourselves. So something like this. And we can recover the highlights in this reflection, I bet just a little bit. I'm going to lower my opacity to 20% and just do a few clicks. Actually, it doesn't come down all that much. Boom, boom. So a person can spend a lot longer time on that than this, but we've just recovered our highlights in a really natural, believable way. We've opened the shadows nicely. We have the full dynamic range of the scene. And this kind of becomes like the starting point for all of this. One other technique that I think this could maybe benefit from a little bit is what I kind of call, it's like a localized Orton effect, where essentially I'm going to create a large pixel radius blur of the image. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of that to help kind of open the shadows and separate background, or in this case, midground from foreground. Because right now, all of this rock formation is like equal in its contrast. But to have a sense of depth, ideally, we should open these shadows just a bit more. And we can do that through kind of a localized Orton effect that'll also kind of give it a sense of atmosphere while we're doing it. So the way that I do that is I create a merge visible layer, Control Shift Alt E or Command Option Shift E, just like we did with the first Orton effect. But this one, we're going to blur a lot, like a really large pixel radius. So we're going all the way up into this territory, which is like, holy cow, I can't see anything. This is Mr. Magoo territory. And what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the opacity of this a lot, like all the way down to like a 10% or something. So the effect of it is very subtle. We're also going to, let's go ahead and open it in Adobe Camera Raw. And we'll just brighten it and just add the tiniest bit of warmth. Just that, like not much at all. And then we're going to put a black layer mask on it. And so you guys can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going to juice up this effect. I'll take the opacity up to like 17%. Grab a paintbrush, 10% opacity, and I'm just going to manually just paint this into our background area here. And because I'm working with that low opacity, it's going to work in very slowly, which is the way I recommend doing these effects, like slowly bring it in. And you can see that it's just the most subtle kind of hazing out of that background. Before, after, before, after. If we do more of it, we'll go up to 80%. It's just a way to kind of open the shadows in this background. We can also do it close to the horizon here and emphasize that sense of depth, because all depth really is gradients of contrast or gradients of layers that where the black point can no longer go all the way to black. Like in our foreground, the blacks go very close to black, or the black point does. And then it should get subtly less as things get further away from camera and we start getting more and more particulates or mist or sea spray between us and our eyes. And when we go through and we add contrast with, while post-processing, that's one of the first things to disappear, is that sense of depth and distance. And so this is a way to bring it back. So it's just a very subtle effect. If I really juice it up, you can kind of see what it is. I know through webinars and like Zoom, you can't hardly tell what's going on, but before, after, hopefully you guys can see that. And it's a subtle thing, but it's a nice thing. And I usually do that in conjunction with an Orton effect. So then I would also do an Orton effect over the top of this. But one other thing I wanted to show you that I haven't done yet is a way of adding contrast to only the tones that you want to affect. So if we wanted to add a little contrast to this image, the last thing we would want to do is to have any of that go into these shadows that are already very dark. So what we could do is we could just grab a lights 1 luminosity mask and then create a levels adjustment. And that lights 1 luminosity mask will have this as its layer mask. That way, when we grab this midtone slider and take it to the right, you can see that we're adding a nice amount of contrast to the highlights, but we're leaving those shadows alone. And we could even do that with a more restrictive, I think we should have done it with a more restrictive luminosity mask. So let's grab a lights 1. We'll modify it by taking this left slider and taking it right. That way we're really blocking up these shadows. That way they're not going to be included in this contrast adjustment. Then we'll go back TK actions and we'll create a levels adjustment with that as its layer mask. So this is its layer mask now. White reveals, which means that this contrast is going to go into the lighthouse, the sky, and the water, but stay out of our shadows. That way we can get away with a bit more contrast without fear of ruining our shadows. So that's a really useful way to add contrast to a scene that is already high dynamic range. And the last thing it needs is deeper blacks, because they're already all the way over to the left on our histogram. So we can't darken those anymore, which means that we need to restrict this adjustment only to the brighter tones. So any questions?
Of course. So one question, and I don't know if the answer is, maybe you had to restart Photoshop and you couldn't share. Do you have the prior Grand Canyon image before and after, or did we lose that one?
I closed it. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's all right. Things happen.
I'm a bad person.
Yeah, well, we'll deal with that later. But
like as soon as you guys lost connection, that was when I really did the magic. Like that's when it really started looking good. Much better.
Michael asks, how feathered is your brush?
All the way.
Yeah.
Like right now, if I grab my paintbrush, I'm not sharing. If I go and there, and grab my paintbrush, you can see that I have my hardness all the way left. Quick tip, if you just right click, it brings up this menu, which is really nice. And when I'm changing my brush sizes without you seeing me doing anything, it's because I'm using my bracket keys. So the left bracket key makes it smaller, right key bracket key makes it bigger.
Okay.
Quick tip.
Great. Let's see, we got a lot of questions. So let's see. How many processing techniques or tips for shots directly into the sun like this one?
Yeah, so essentially your exposure blending, and I could do one of those if we have time. But essentially, you want those brightest, or not the brightest, you want those darkest images that are just for those brightest highlights around your sun star. You want those to be as bright as you can get them, but lower contrast. Because when you start getting close to that edge of the histogram, you need to kind of roll off on the contrast, kind of have that highlight roll off where you decrease the contrast. Sometimes I'll actually add some negative dehaze. That way the area around that sun star is still all the way almost to white or white, but you're decreasing the contrast around it. That way it's a more subtle, slow transition from that to the sky around it. So, I start with my sky image and then I recover the highlights around the sun star, and then I have a shadow image as well. So typically that's when I'll have a 3-image exposure blend.
Great. We'll probably have time for one more good technique demonstration, but we still got more questions. Unfortunately, we'll be able to answer, which is good. Lots of good ones. So I'm trying to make sure, but I like this one. Jim asks, you're such an expert at this. What recommendations could you give us for learning these techniques? There's so much to learn. How did you go through about learning all of this? Could you walk them through your kind of learning curve or steps?
So I always refer to it as like you learn Photoshop the same way you would eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So you learn it in just one little thing at a time. So for me, like the first things I learned in Photoshop were like how to use like the spot healing brush, because it's way faster in Photoshop than it is in Lightroom. So I would open it up in Photoshop. I'll get rid of my sensor dust. I'll save it and go back into Lightroom where it was like my safe place. Because, a lot of people, they view Lightroom as like what they're comfortable with. They're safe there. And Photoshop is where you can really screw up an image. That's kind of how we view it. So I would do those, just a couple techniques like that. The next thing that I learned was like how to use content aware fill around the edges of panoramas. And that was useful, especially back before Lightroom could do that. And so I'd save it, go back. And then I started like finding things that I couldn't do in Lightroom anymore, like learning how to warp objects to correct for wide angle distortion that you can't get rid of. Like, or sometimes you'll shoot a panorama with a wide angle lens, right? And that when you do that, you think about how a wide angle lens works. It pinches everything in the middle and then the edges get stretched out. Well, if you do that, a wide angle panorama, those mountains in the center of your frame are getting pancaked. So they're like abnormally short. So ideally you can stretch those back out. And that was the useful thing. So what you do is you just learn it one little bit at a time, and then you save, go back into Lightroom. And then before long, you have a whole toolbox full of things that you can do. And you don't really want to edit in Lightroom anymore because it's too restrictive. But the best thing that you can do is just to get out of your comfort zone and learn it one little bite at a time, one little technique at a time.
Great. Well, I think that's probably a good thing. So you get the opportunity to push us one more time out of our comfort zone.
All right.
One more.
One more. Let's do it.
All right. Let's do it.
All right. Let's go back over into Lightroom here. God, there's so many good images. Special shout out to this one. This is such a great image. It's like huge dynamic range scene. Obviously, this one could definitely use some luminosity work. I think let's go ahead and process on this one. The first thing I'm going to do here is we'll open up the shadows, boost the exposure. That way we've got some detail in the lava, but we don't need much, obviously, because the story is not so much about the dark areas of the lava. It's about the beautiful highlights in the flowing lava. So we're gonna warm it up just the tiniest bit so it's not too blue into those deep shadows. And we'll go ahead, right click, edit in, open it as smart object. So in this one, we're definitely going to process it once for highlights, once for shadows. But another technique that I want to show you is a great way to like really bring out depth in a sky and to really emphasize your favorite bits, right? So we've already opened up our shadow areas for the darkest part of the lava. Let's create another new smart object via copy. And this one, I want to recover whatever highlights we can in the flowing magma there. But I want to do it in a way where we don't lose any saturation. So let me click on that. I'm going to darken it down a bit, recover some highlights, lift the shadows a bit. Something like this. I want to really have that lava not go all the way to white. Like there was some places where, you know, it was getting close to being blown out, and I don't want those to be snow white. I want them to still have that nice lava color. So we'll hit OK. So the first thing is we're going to put a black layer mask on here and just bring this into those areas that are getting too hot. No pun intended. So we'll go grab a luminosity mask. We can base it on red, which will help, and see how very selected that is. We can also check a lights 2, and that looks like a perfect luminosity mask for this use case. So I'm going to make a selection of this. That way it's going to function like a stencil. And when I paint this, we're recovering highlights, but we're doing it in a way to where we're not losing contrast. But we are gaining a whole lot of detail, but we're also gaining some nice saturation in those hot bits. So like if I zoom in here so you can really see the purpose, look at this right here. You can see how we're gaining the color back. Like that, whoops. We're gaining the saturation back and the detail back. And if we feel like maybe we over recovered those highlights, we could always just decrease the opacity of this layer just the tiniest bit. All right, next thing I want to do is let's do some dodging, or actually no, let's do some burning in the sky and start bringing out some depth and dimension in the sky. So if we look at the sky, we've got highlights, but there's also some shadows in there, and those shadows are more of a cold blue. So what I want to do is let's create a new dodge burn layer, change the blend mode to soft light, and let's go and let's try to create a dark luminosity mask off a blue channel. But what we're actually going to have to do is we're going to have to base it off a red channel. So notice the difference here. When I have blue selected as my color channel, it functions normally as we go this way in our lights, but it's actually the reverse when we go negative, meaning that it's actually is selecting less of the blue channel rather than more. So what we actually need to do is we need to base it on the red channel, and you see how it's masking out those areas of the red sky. That's exactly what we want. We want a selection that'll allow our paint to go into the dark blues up here, but keep us out of those red plumes as they're coming up. So this would be a pretty good selection to burn through. If we go to a 3, that there's like almost nothing to select there. So we'll go to a darks 2 off the red channel, which it means it's actually off the yellow channel. And then we'll make a selection of that. So we have that as our active stencil, right? So we're going to select this color. It's happening up in the sky naturally. We're going to darken it, desaturate it. Start off with like a 20% opacity brush. And we're going to start on the top up here. And we're just going to start painting across our sky. Where we're going to get the most mileage with this is close to these bright highlights here. So as I paint through here, you can see that we're starting to create some luminance difference between the bright plumes and the dark storm clouds, or the dark clouds back behind the smoke that is rising out of those out of the volcano. So what we're going to do is do some burning like this for a little bit. I'm trying to hurry. It's always fun to try to process, but not only process, but process fast, because I know we don't have a lot of time.
And teach too.
Yeah. But we're also going to end up creating a dark halo on this mountaintop. And that's okay because we're going to purposely do that so we can fix it. So going through here, and if I create a before and after, I just go before, after. Look at how much more depth the sky takes on. This is such a powerful technique. Sean Bagshaw calls it cloud sculpting. And this is the perfect image for that, because as things get darker, highlights become more impactful. And we don't want our brightest highlights to be in a part of the image that is not the reason for the image, or not what we want the viewer to be looking at. We want the eye to go boom to the amazing lava. So one way to do that is to control the highlights everywhere else. So before, after, maybe it's overdone. I don't care. It's awesome. It's cool. We'll run with it. So when we did this, though, we darkened the top of these mountaintops, or the whatever they're called. I can't think of what they're called. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, there's so many different ways to do it. I have to decide. What we're going to do is we're going to throw this into a folder. So we're going to click the new group. We're going to drag it into the group. And then we're going to put a layer mask on that group. So now our Dodge burn layer is inside this folder, and it has a layer mask. Now we can erase things if we need to. So what I'm going to do is just create a luminosity mask that's going to target just the darker tones that were over darkened. So you see this darks 4 is a perfect selection of everything below the horizon line. So I'm going to make a selection of that. So now it's functioning like a stencil. Now I'm going to grab the color black, because we're going to hide or conceal this burning layer where we over darkened. So I'm going to grab 100% opacity brush, just go over the horizon. So you see, if I deactivate this layer mask and then activate it, we just erased it from the mountain essentially with this layer mask. Also, what I love is you can see the hordes of tourists. So many tourists were there when this volcano went active. Okay, now I want to do the exact opposite, where we brighten some of these, some of the smoke that's being lit up by the lava. So what I'm going to do is do essentially the opposite. New blend, new layer, change the blend mode to soft light. We're going to grab a luminosity mask that's going to target just that. So we're creating it off the red channel. We can modify it. So I'm purposely darkening it down to that way only those red plumes of smoke are really being illuminated. You see how we're really isolating these red plumes. We based it off the red color channel, and then we modified it with a levels adjustment. Now we're going to select it. Going to grab a paintbrush. We're going to sample this kind of orangey red color. We're going to brighten it. Going to go, let's say 20% opacity brush. And then we're just going to start doing a few passes. I want it to be brightest close to the light sources, and then fade out kind of as it gets further away. That way it's a natural look. So I'm starting close, low on the horizon, and then fading it out. And it's only going to allow my paint to essentially go into the areas where it belongs anyway. So before, after. See, we're just emphasizing what's already there. One other thing I want to do here is, this is a compositional thing. This slope below the lava here really doesn't add much. So we could just crop it. But what I'm going to do, because I'm tricksy like that, is I want to emphasize the amount of real estate taken up by all this awesome lava. So I'm going to create a merge visible layer, Control Shift Alt E or Command Option Shift E. That gives us pixels to play with. I'm going to make a selection of everything, essentially all the land. And I did that with a rectangular marquee tool. Now we're going to free transform this. So I'm going to hit Control T or Command T on a Mac. And that allows us to basically transform this. I'm going to hold down Shift and drag down on this bottom key. And essentially it's a compositional thing where I want this to be a nice border for the bottom while also maximizing the amount of real estate that this lava was taking up. And it's not like crazy stretching a mountain or anything, but it's a pretty huge impact on the image. We could continue to go on. I would definitely do an Orton effect. Let's do it. So I create a merge visible layer, gonna blur it. Go about 40 pixels, decrease the opacity down to 20 something. Throw a Lights One luminosity mask on it. And then we're going to brighten. Well, we're gonna open it up in Adobe Camera Raw. And I want to brighten, but in this case, I don't think I actually want to warm it up. We're just going to brighten and add saturation and hit OK. So now that lava is taking on a bit more of a glow. We're going to decrease the opacity to taste. And then it's going to look something like, oh, come on, computer, do it. It's freezing on me, damn it. Well, gonna look something like that. Any questions?
Before and after, or is your computer giving up?
No, I think we can do it.
Let's do it.
Before, see how much more eye-catching the sky is and how the lava is more blown out. After, maximize the depth in the sky by kind of darkening it down. I might even do it more. And also, I think warping it down made a pretty big difference on the composition too. But yep, that's what I would do. Using luminosity masks to like control where your contrast goes and to, really bring out depth and dimension, and using it as a stencil when you're dodging and burning is such a game changer. Like, it's so useful to paint through that selection, use it like a stencil. That way it becomes exactly what you need it to be. That way you don't have to be perfect when you're dodging and burning. It's such a game changer.
Yeah. So we definitely have, we're at time. We'll probably go just a few minutes over because of the little drop glitch, because we have some good questions. Well, chats are starting to come through, loving sky techniques, brains full, but in a good way. Geez, I'm so glad this is recorded. I learned so much. This was certainly worth the price of admission, LOL. The questions are, when do you clone in your process with smart objects? And I think we kind of showed towards the tail end. And I think it was a drone. Somebody thought it was a UFO. Somebody else thought it was a helicopter. But, when do you clone in that process?
I always consider, I save my destructive layers for last usually. So I consider destructive layers like the free transform, because that requires a pixel layer that's destructive. So I save that for last. I save cleaning up all those sensor dust spots and stuff for last, getting rid of drones for last. I try to do that right before I sharpen. So the very last step is always sharpening, because a lot of times in my master file, I don't even do a sharpening layer. I save that for either a print export or a web export. So sharpening is last. Right before that are my cleanup layers, or my stretch this mountain layer.
Yeah. Sounds good. What color profile do you usually start with within Lightroom?
Photo. Yeah, I usually edit everything in Photo.
Okay. How about related to the actual of the Adobe profiles? Which one do you No. The question was color profile, which is great. But then also invariably, David talked a lot and showed a lot on different profiles. So
typically I don't mess with it all that much, honestly. I usually just start in a standard if I'm in a really flat, if it's a really flat image and I know it needs lots of contrast, lots of saturation, I might go to Adobe Landscape. But for the most part, I stick with standard because so many of my color adjustments are, I don't know, are more finessed in with luminosity masks and stuff that like that has a bigger influence on it than the actual profile I start with, I find.
Yeah, great. Couple comments about Nick's a great presentator. That's my word.
Presentator.
Contract. I just want to stress, and I want to say thank you, first of all, as well. It is really difficult. I've unsuccessfully and borderline failed in the past of trying to teach luminosity masks over Zoom. It's really hard, especially pulling in the wide variety of content from a wide variety of images submitted by really talented photographers here. And I just personally want to say I think you did an excellent job. There's a lot of information here. For those of you with the heads that are exploding right now, give it some time. It'll sink in. I have definitely a lot of good pickouts myself too. And there's a lot of people that seem to like your hat, Nick. So leave it better. So.
By the way, I sell these.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So those that don't know, these Leave It Better hats, 100% of the profits go to the National Forest Foundation to replant trees. So got a few left if you guys, a little soft plug there, but
here we go.
Yeah, when I do these things, especially like the real value is in the rewatch and the recording, because you can't retain something the first time you see it unless you are Albert Einstein. So, and I don't think any of us in this room are.
Yeah.
So it's so nice that I try to use the fire hose approach and work kind of fast, because during the replay you get the pause button, and that's kind of nice. Pause it, work on your own image, be like, meh, and then move on to the next thing, and find those little nuggets. And the other thing is just because I do something to a certain amount does not mean that that's going to match your personal style or taste. Like, you can dial all this stuff back as much as you need, or amp it up, go for it, man. But either way, it's just another tool in the toolbox, and just understanding some of the potential and some of the possibilities with luminosity masks it can spark creativity, because then it gives you ideas of things to try.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to say thank you. And for those of you still with us, we've had a good bulk of people still stay all the way to the end. A lot of people pick it up. Tomorrow, probably mid-morning, you'll get the recording, the actions, and some other information as well, along with a discount from Mr. Page. I shouldn't call him Mr. Page. Not trying to be formal, just trying to be funny. From Nick with a K on some of his other tutorials and classes. And I know it's been a long week. We're towards the end of the week, but I'm so glad you came, Nick. And on behalf of the Nature Photography Classes community, thank you for sharing your knowledge. And we will hopefully have you back in the future.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to watching the other guys' presentations too, because you got quite the lineup. So thank you so much for having me. And thank you to all of those that hung out with me for this long.
Yeah.
You must really not have anything going on.
Somebody thought it was Hardcastle that was pranking your computer. I think it was perfect timing. I think Greg Benz had a Lumenzia thing in your computer that was like, oh, you don't want to demonstrate Lumenzia? I'm going to shut down your screen share. So, exactly. All right. Well, go enjoy your night, and we'll be in touch all.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. We'll catch you later.
Bye.